If you're using the Church Bible, it's on page 875. Page 875. We're doing Lamentations verses 1 to 6. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. After affliction and harsh labour, Judah has gone into exile. She dwells among the nations. She finds no resting place. All who pursue her have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to her appointed festivals. All her gateways are desolate. Her priests groan, her young women grieve, and she is in bitter anguish. Her foes have become her masters. Her enemies are at ease. The Lord has brought her grief because of her many sins. Her children have gone into exile, captive before the foe. All the splendour has departed from daughter Zion. Her princes are like deers that find no pasture. In weakness they have fled before the pursuer.
Well, it's brilliant to see everyone, and welcome to those watching at home online. And some people loved it so much at 9:30 that they've stayed till 11, which is great. And not just Andrew, who had to because he was leading. So that's great. So that's how I'm interpreting that. But it could also be, couldn't it? I had no clue what was going on there. I need to stay for the second one to have a second go and see if I can decipher what's going on. Because we're diving in to this new book of the Bible, Lamentations. And it is off the beaten track for many of us. Now, I wonder if you ever go into the Lake District. It's right here on our doorstep. It's one of the most beautiful parts of the country. And the Lake District's interesting, isn't it? Because there's some parts of it that are so well-known, almost crowded, lots of visitors. But there's other places that are pretty off the beaten track, where you can still, even now, be on your own on a hillside or something. I know that's not often the case, but this time of year it could be. On your own. My favourite lake in the Lake District is Wasswater, and Wasswater is one of the less crowded ones. It's pretty hard to get to. I mean, even here we are in Carlisle, which is in Cumbria, and even from here it's about an hour and a half to get there. It's only really handy if you live in Whitehaven. It's not really handy for anyone else. But Wasswater is, I think, beautiful just because it's so stark and sort of, there's these sort of barren hillsides and real majestic kind of high-sided mountains and things. And anyway, but it's off the beaten track. Now, if you were going to go, you might want to go with somebody who already has been and knows the way and knows to park and can show you around or something. Or at the very least, if you can't get someone to do that, maybe somebody who's been could draw you a little map or say, don't go to this bit, go to this bit, or, I recommend this route or whatever. Well, here we are going to look at Lamentations, and it is as kind of off the beaten track bit of the Bible. So unusually this morning, we're going to spend quite a long time on the introduction, because it's not just going to be an introduction for today. It's going to be an introduction for the whole 5-week series. We're going to take a bit more time than we usually would, just to put it into its context, to help us understand what's going on, because it's not super familiar to most of us. Although, if you were Jewish, it might be somewhat familiar, because even to this day, in the synagogue, once a year, Lamentations is read out. It's done on the anniversary of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, although it often now commemorates other calamities that have come upon the Jewish people, like the Holocaust, etc. but they read through the book of Lamentations once a year. So it'd be familiar to them in the way that some of the Christmas readings might be familiar to us that we hear once a year at Christmas. But most of us did not grow up going to a synagogue, and most of us probably don't know that much about the book. So we're going to take some time. Now I should say, to do this, I've drawn on some resources that I already had. Some of you will remember several times actually at the church here, we've done the whole Bible in 2 hours. Maybe on a Sunday afternoon, some of us have got together and we've tried to do the big storyline of the whole Bible in 2 hours and cover what's going on. And so some of the slides, I've got quite a few slides at in the first half of this. Some of the slides you might recognise from that, but I've drawn on that to help us to see where we are in the Bible timeline, what's going on, and I think that will pay dividends over the coming weeks. Now, if you're a visitor and you're only here this week, you might think, oh, you know, I've got all the introduction and none of the actual thing. So I'm sorry for that, but I hope there's something useful here anyway. So, the story so far, and I'm talking here about the story in the whole Bible. So, the story so far is that God made the world, God made the first humans, Adam and Eve, and he gave them somewhere to live. And Jane, if you just have the next slide, here we have, it's not an actual photo of Adam and Eve, but here we have Adam and Eve, God's people, and he put them into his place, the Garden of Eden, into his world, but into the Garden of Eden, and they enjoyed his blessing and rule. He was in charge, he was the king. And that was fantastic, apart from people rejected God's good rule, sin entered the world, and because of that, the people had to leave God's good place. So they rejected his rule, they had to leave the place, and they were no longer his people in the way that they had been before. All that happens within the first couple of chapters of the Bible, literally in the first few pages. And it has been said that the whole rest of the Bible is God's rescue plan. The whole rest of the Bible is restoring these things. The whole rest of the Bible is about God restoring what was lost. God's people in God's place, enjoying his blessing. And actually, by the time we get to the very end of Revelation, that's exactly what we see restored. But on the way, there's quite a lot happens. And on the way in the Old Testament, God starts to gather a people again. He chooses Abraham, and from Abraham and his family grows a nation. He gives them a land. He tells Abraham that there's a land that is promised him and that he can go and enjoy. It's described as a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey. I have a picture here of a land and some milk and honey. I would imagine you've got to be careful where you walk if it's a land flowing with milk and honey. There'll be sticky pools all over the place. But that's a way of describing the land. It's like us saying it's a land flowing with pizza and ice cream. It just means it's got the good stuff. It's a good land. It's not just, a duff bit. It's a good place. And God says, that's the place that I've promised to you. So God starts to put back the things that were lost in the garden. And Jed, if we're going to have the next slide. He starts to gather the people. I mentioned Abraham and his family, but they grow into a great nation. Here's what 1 Kings 4 says. The people, if we could go back, sorry, Jed. It says, the people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. The people grow into a great nation. He's given them this place, this land flowing with milk and honey. Here's what 1 Kings 4:21 says. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. So he gave them this land under David, King David, who's Solomon, who's been talked about here, his dad. The nation expanded and grew its borders, and they had this good land that God had given them. And they were also enjoying God's blessing and rule. Here's 1 Kings 4 again. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, that's from the top to the bottom, lived in safety, each man under his own vine and fig tree. Again, that's a picture of bounty and the good life. You don't need to go to Aldi to pick up grapes or figs because you've got your own. You've grown your own. It's the good life. And God's rule, following his rules, are part of his blessing. We sometimes think of rules as being a negative and something that restricts our freedom. But it is a good thing, isn't it, that God says people can't come into your house and take all your stuff. It's a good thing that God says someone can't, walk up to you with a big knife and stab you and kill you. Do you know what I mean? They're some of God's good rules. They're there to be a blessing and a help to us. So God had made this promise or covenant, a really serious promise with Abraham, and repeated it to others. And he was starting to put these things into place. And Solomon, who's around when all this is being said, was putting into place one of the final things as he built a great temple in Jerusalem. Here's something that was said at the opening of that temple. 1 Kings 8, around that time, Solomon says, "Praise be to the Lord, who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed of all the good promises he gave through his servant Moses." So all these things have been lost when Adam and Eve were there in the garden, but God's been putting them back into place. He's been restoring them. Solomon built his temple. We don't have an actual photo of it, but we have a photo of a model that a man made in a shed in Norfolk. There you go. So there's a model of what it might have looked like. And it was amazing, this amazing temple that had been built. Things were going well for the nation. I've got a little timeline here that just shows us, we started with creation, we had Adam and Eve. Things went downhill because of sin. But then we get this turning point as God makes these promises to Abraham and then Isaac and Jacob. And things are gradually on the up. And then you see the yellow star of David. Under David and then his son Solomon, things are going really quite well. God is in charge, as the crown there symbolises. But sadly, it didn't stay that way. Look at this verse from 2 Kings. 2 Kings 17. The Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam, he's one of their kings, and did not turn away from them until the Lord removed them from his presence, as he had warned through all his servants, the prophets. So the people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile in Assyria and are still there. So at the time that 2 Kings 17 is being written, they're still there. Now it says the Israelites, and we think of the Israelites, the people of Israel, but actually by this point, the nation has had almost, it was on the brink of, a civil war. They've really fallen out between the north and the south. And this is referring to the northern kingdom, which was carried on being called Israel. The southern kingdom was called Judah. And we can see here how it was divided. The dividing line between the north and the south was just 8 miles north of Jerusalem. So just like the Scottish border is roughly 10 miles away from us, isn't it? The border was right there. And the Assyrians came, captured the north, and so the border of the Assyrian Empire was just up the road from Jerusalem. They must have been living in fear. I've got a little slide that just shows some of these events. So the kingdom split. It wasn't an equal split. There were 12 tribes in the people of Israel. But Israel is the 10 tribes in the north, and the 2 in the south became known as Judah. Both the north and the south had good kings and bad kings, but they were mostly bad kings, especially in the north. The northern kingdom lasted until 722 BC when the Assyrians captured it. We just heard that verse describing that. But the southern kingdom lasted a bit longer until 586. Of course, when it's BC, the numbers work the opposite way to the work now. So 586 is closer to us than 722. And that's when the Babylonians come. And that last line on here is the events that Lamentations talking about. I have a little map of the Babylonian Kingdom. It's the green area in the middle. And you can see the red line showing the route that some of the people who were captured in Jerusalem will have likely taken on their way back to Babylon. You can't go straight line because it's the desert, so people would follow round that way, round the top. It's actually the way that Abraham had come to get there in the first place. It's kind of a reverse journey. Babylon's in what's now Iraq. And you can see how the Babylonian Empire spread. It swallowed up what we would now call Israel. Its big rival was Egypt, which you can see down in the bottom corner. And they fought against each other, not really conclusively, although Babylon were harder to take on than Egypt had expected, I think. And Egypt, I think we're feeling pretty confident when they met the Babylonians, but it didn't go quite as they expected. Well, there's another significant thing that we need to just have clear in our heads to help us understand Lamentations. Jed, if we could have this picture. This is a picture of what someone else called the Tabernacle. It's just a really special tent. God had instructed the people to make this when they left Egypt. Here's what Exodus 29 says. God says, "They will know that I am the Lord their God who brought them out of Egypt so that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God." So the people of Israel have come from Egypt, were living in the desert. God instructs them to make this special tent, this tabernacle, and it's right there in the middle of the camp. So they're all camped around it. And symbolically, God's right there in the middle of things. And God's presence is said to be in the Holy of Holies, in that innermost part, right there in the middle of the camp. And that transferred into the stone temple. So the picture we've already seen, thanks Jay, of this, that was all reproduced. So these outer courtyards are like those areas we saw around the tent. And then there was an inner Holy of Holies where God's presence was dwelling. But we read something really sad in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel 10 says this: "Then the glory of the Lord rose from above the cherubim." The cherubim are on top of the Ark of Covenant, which is in the innermost part of the temple. And it moved to the threshold of the temple, moves to the door. And then a couple of verses on, then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple. And God's presence leaves the temple and leaves Jerusalem. It's really sad. Why has this happened? Well, it's happened because the people have turned to worship other gods. They've started worshipping idols and gods from some of the nations around them. And that's even been going on within the temple itself, Ezekiel tells us. God has warned them time and time again not to do this, but eventually he allows calamity to come upon them and the Babylonians to come. So that was the story so far, and giving us a bit of background. Here's what that looks like on our timeline thing that we had. You see, again, the high point there under the Star of David there, under David and Solomon, but then it all goes downhill again. It splits into two as the nation falls out, and splits into two, and the large E of Exodus had dominated the first part of the Old Testament as they were rescued from Egypt, and now exile and then being removed from the Promised Land dominates the latter part of the Old Testament. God's still in charge, but the people are asking questions. People are asking, what is God up to? What is God up to? How has this happened? What's going on? There'd been this great promise to Abraham that was going to reverse the effects of the fall from Eden. And the three parts to the promise, God's people, well, they became a great nation, but now they've been humbled. They were given the promised land, but now they've been removed from the land. They were enjoying God's blessing. Remember, everyone had their own fig tree and vine. They were following God's law. Except now they're following foreign laws because they've been removed. They're not feeling the blessing anymore. And it's that context that the book of Lamentations comes. So I've called this series Finding Hope in the Darkness, because for them it was feeling pretty dark. King Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians has attacked. He'd actually been earlier and demanded that they pay an annual tribute. They had to pay money, like protection money, to Nebuchadnezzar. But the king Jehoiachin rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. He thought he could get help from Egypt against the Babylonians, but that turned out to not. It didn't really work out for him. And so Nebuchadnezzar comes back. On one of his earlier missions, he'd taken some of the people away. You might know the story of Daniel. Daniel is one of the people taken away. But he comes back. He imprisons the king. He installs a new guy to be king called Zedekiah. But it all repeats again. Zedekiah again rebels. Nebuchadnezzar comes back. And this time there's a 2-year siege of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar builds a siege works right around the city. Nothing can go in or out. Now, an earlier king of Jerusalem had built, Hezekiah had built some underwater tunnels to bring fresh water into the city. And so they had water, which I guess is why they could hold out for 2 years. But they didn't have food coming into the city. And there is terrible conditions within the city. Terrible food shortages and starvation. And we'll see some of that as we go on into Lamentations, especially chapter 2. You can read all about the siege in 2 Kings 24 and 25. We haven't got time, sadly, to look at that now. But eventually, after 2 years, the walls are breached. The Babylonians charge into the city. Actually, the king and some of his officials and things make a break for it at the other side, the opposite side to where they break through the wall. They sneak out through a gate and make a run for it, heading for Jericho, but they're hunted down and caught on the way. I guess they've not been eaten properly for 2 years. They wouldn't be, up to sort of marathon speed, would they? Right, trying to escape. And the Babylonians are able to hunt them down and capture them. And the last thing that the king sees before Nebuchadnezzar blinds him and puts out his eyes is his own sons being executed in front of him. It is a terrible, terrible time for the people. Interestingly, in 1975, which some of us might remember was a very hot summer, in 1975 there was an archaeological dig in Jerusalem, and they found at the bottom of the ruin of one of the towers of the wall from this period a whole layer of ash, and in the ash were arrowheads that were Babylonian arrowheads. It actually tells us in 2 Kings 25, verse 9, that Nebuchadnezzar ordered the city burned. Everything was burned and ruined, walls pulled down, etc. It's interesting that ties up with what the archaeologists have found. So, here we are at Lamentations. Now, there's something you just need to know about Lamentations, because we miss this when we read it in English or a different language, because we're not reading it in Hebrew. It's a collection of 5 poems. Can we just have these? It took me ages to make this slide. Look at the artwork going on here. It's a collection of 5 poems, and here's the unusual thing. Number 1, number 2, number 4 and 5 all have 22 verses, but the middle one has 3 times as many. It has 66. The first, second, and third are all acrostic poems. So the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters, not 26 like English. And each line of these poems starts with the next letter of their alphabet. So it'd be like us saying, a beautiful cat did escape. I'm struggling now, can't I? Anyway, but you get the idea. So, but it's not single words, it's lines. So each line of the poem starts with the next letter of the alphabet. So there's a bit of work gone into this. We totally miss it. It doesn't work in English, but it works in Hebrew. We totally miss it. So that's what's happening. But the middle one, which has 66 lines, they're grouped in 3. So the first 3 lines would start with A. Then the line 4, 5, and 6 start with B. And then 7, 8, 9 start with C. So it's like that. So it's like a triple whammy. Just like when at McDonald's they start putting extra burgers in there and make these ludicrous big Scooby snack burgers. It's rammed full. And actually, I've done it like a little, this is the artwork bit really, I've done it like a little pyramid because it's actually that middle chapter, chapter 3, where the high point of Lamentations comes. So in English, we often leave the punchline to the end, or the big climax to the end. In Hebrew writing, it's very common for the main thing to be in the middle, and they kind of circle round an idea, and the main thing's in the middle. And we will get to that and see what's going on in chapter 3 later in this series. Now, I think it has much to teach us. But you might think, but why are we looking at this? Why are we giving up time on a Sunday morning to look at something written 2,500 years ago about events that seem very obscure and remote to us, people we don't know, and events that, you don't do that in history at school, do you? Why are we doing it? Well, it's not just an interesting history lecture, and I hope this doesn't turn into that, but I think it's important for us to look at, and here's one reason why. Look with me at what Romans 15 verse 4 says. Paul, writing there, says, "For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the Scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope." So it was written to teach us. Why? Well, so that we can understand the endurance, we can see the encouragement, and that in turn will give us hope. And we sometimes don't like being taught new things, do we? We sometimes don't like having to have endurance, although we maybe know it's good for us. But who doesn't want encouragement and hope? And we get all these good things. It can teach us, we can see the endurance, we can be encouraged, we can have hope. Lamentations is not an unnecessary bit of the Bible. God has included it for a reason. In fact, one of the people I was reading as I've been preparing described it in this way. They said it's soul medicine, so medicine for the soul, from the wisest of doctors. From the wisest of doctors. God knows that there's something in here that we need. And ultimately, over the next 5 weeks, I hope it's going to show us why Jesus had to come and why we need him. Well, that was a mammoth introduction, wasn't it? But I hope that's going to stand us in good stead, as I said, over coming weeks. I think it was worth taking some time just to see what is going on. But we're going to dive in now to these first 6 verses. And you might find it useful to have it open in front of you. It's page 875 if you're using one of the church Bibles. And Lamentations is telling us about God's people back then, particularly about the city of Jerusalem, which is also here called Zion. But it's described as a person. So Jerusalem is personified as a lady. In fact, as we meet her in verse 1, she's a queen. She was a queen among the provinces. But now, she's become a slave. Could you get more of a contrast in the ancient mind between a queen and the slave? And these first 6 verses catalogue for us, lay out for us, some of the tremendous loss that Jerusalem has experienced. So we're just going to look at this very quickly. In verse 1, there's a loss of abundance. Look how it opens. How deserted lies the city once so full of people. It was a bustling hub. It was a capital city. It's now a deserted ruin. We've already seen the queen to slave analogy. A loss of abundance, a loss of what was going on. In verse 2, there's a loss of allies. The friends have betrayed her. In fact, they've become enemies. But look how it describes some of these surrounding nations. Among all her lovers, there was no one to comfort her. A hint there at where the problem lies. She's been chasing after these other nations, maybe hoping Egypt could bail her out, maybe adopting a foreign god from here, an idol from here, a bit of sun or moon worship, or whatever. Elsewhere in the Old Testament tells us about these very things happening there. So a loss of abundance in verse 1, a loss of allies in verse 2. Verse 3, a loss of resting place. She's gone into exile. She's been removed from where she is. In fact, she finds no resting place. People have been pursuing her and overtaking her in the midst of her distress. Do you remember I mentioned that the king and some of his officials made a run for it at the end of the 2-year siege, but were hunted down? It's maybe hinting a little bit at that as well. So verse 1, a loss of abundance. Verse 2, a loss of allies. Verse 3, a loss of resting place. Verse 4, a loss of happiness. Verse 4 mentions mourning. It mentions groaning and grieving. It mentions bitter anguish. It had been such a joyous place. They used to celebrate their festivals there. Now no one's there for the festivals. You know, things like how we would think of Christmas or Easter or those sort of high days. The celebration, the joy. It's all gone. So a loss of abundance, allies, resting place, happiness. Verse 5, a loss of position. Do you remember how on my chart, under David and Solomon, people used to come from far around to visit Israel, to see what was going on, to hear of the wisdom there, to see the plenty and the riches that they had. But now their foes have become their masters. They're brought low. They're not in an elevated position now. They're in a lowly position. Loss of abundance, loss of allies, loss of resting place, loss of happiness, loss of position. Verse 6, a loss of courage. The splendour has departed. Her princes are like deer that find no pasture. In weakness they have fled before the pursuer. Their courage has gone. They're making a run for it. But even that doesn't work. And so disaster has come. And it is a time to lament. A lament over how low things have gotten. But I wonder if you notice as we just scan through there's a shock, and the shock comes in verse 5. The middle of verse 5 says this: the Lord has brought her grief. So yes, it's the Babylonians who've come, but they're just really an instrument in the hands of God. God has brought this about. Verse 5 doesn't leave us in any doubt about why God would do this, because we might think, well, why is God doing this? This is her. He's sitting. The Lord has brought her grief because of her many sins. And actually God has been patient. He sent warning after warning, prophet after prophet, called the people back time and time again. In fact, even right through this whole period and the siege and everything, Jeremiah is there working. And many people think it's him who wrote Lamentations. There's a good case could be made for that, although it doesn't tell us that he's written it. But it's all happening because of their sin. In fact, many sins, it says. Our time has almost gone, but you might be thinking, but why are we gonna look at it, Peter? And I've got just very quickly some things that I hope we're going to see over the coming weeks. I hope we've maybe already seen in sort of thumbnail, but it's going to be sketched out for us more completely as we go on. First of all, there's an appropriateness about mourning and sorrow. There is a right time for that. So there's a lot of lament here, and we're going to see it's absolutely laid on thick as we go through. But there is an appropriateness about that. Some things are lamentable. Some things ought to be lamented. Some things ought to be mourned. and so there's some things we should be sorrowful about. I think some people get the impression that Christians somehow have this painted-on smile, and everything's always happy and joyful, and we can't be sad about anything. And of course, there is a genuine Christian joy that comes from knowing the Lord Jesus. But there is an appropriateness to mourning and sorrow at times. There is a right time for it. It's one thing we're going to see. 2, pain and difficulty are not without benefits. Now you might be thinking, well, I was with you on that first one, Peter, but I don't like pain and difficulty. I don't think very many people do they? But there are some benefits to pain and difficulty. C.S. Lewis once said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, but he calls to us in our pain. So when life's going well, when things are easy, it's easy to not think about God. It's easy to not go to him in prayer. It's easy to not think we need him. But when the hardship comes, when the hard time comes, when the difficulty comes, the pain comes, well, maybe we find it a bit easier to pray and call out to him. He's a bit more in our thoughts. Pain and difficulty are not without benefits. That's something else we're going to see. Thirdly, we're going to see that we shouldn't ever dare to take sin lightly. We shouldn't dare take sin lightly. They've been warned time and time again to turn back to God, and it's actually just got worse. Ezekiel records as how in the very temple courtyard, people are bowing down to worship false gods, turning their backs on the innermost part of the temple, and then bowing down, raising their bums towards the innermost part of the temple as they bow down to worship foreign gods, which are no gods at all. Now we think, well, we'd never do that, of course. But we all know the internal conversation that we can have about why this particular thing is okay for us to do, why we know God wouldn't really approve, but, you know, we're a special case, or this is a special circumstance, or it's been particularly hard just lately, or, well, we're very good at convincing ourselves that sin isn't sin. So we're going to see that we shouldn't dare take sin lightly. Fourthly, we're going to see the privilege of living in the time that we live now, and that's only by God's grace. So we live in a time that's relatively safe and relatively prosperous, looking across a historic perspective. And yet there was a time when Israel was exactly like that, and it can change in an instant. And you don't have to be much of a student of history to know that there's plenty of societies that have been prosperous and safe, and it's changed overnight. And actually, it's one of the lessons of COVID, isn't it? That things can change very quickly. So we mustn't miss the privilege and God's grace that we're enjoying in right now, in the time we live in now. You might think, well, I have plenty of hardships, Peter, and I don't doubt that. But we have many, many blessings as well. I've got one final thing. It's great to learn from your mistakes, isn't it? Great to learn from your mistakes. But there's something that's maybe even better, is learning from other people's mistakes and not having to do it yourself. Learning from other people's mistakes. We're going to, I hope, as we go through Lamentations, be able to learn from their mistakes. I just wanted to leave us with that verse we looked at from Romans earlier, Romans 15. Thanks, Jane. Everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in Scripture and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. Well, who doesn't want a bit of hope, need some endurance, and want some encouragement? I hope Lamentations has been a blessing already, but is going to be a blessing to us over the coming weeks. And I hope you're excited about looking at it together and about what God's going to teach us as we look at it. Let's just pray as we close. Father, we thank you that you recorded this bit of the Bible for us along with the other bits. We thank you for that there's much here for us to ponder and think about and learn from. Father, I pray that you give us soft hearts to hear what you want to say to us through these chapters. We pray this in Jesus' name.